Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F-words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic!
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
In February of this year, I was on a trip to explore the battlefields of the Western Front from the Great War. And I was on a small road, as many of the roads in eastern France are, somewhere between Reims and Verdun, near the tiny French commune of Binarville, which is a population of about 100 people. I was in the Argonne Forest, and it was the one and only place in my week in France that I had no cell phone reception. It was, in a lot of ways, reminiscent of my times in the mountains of central Pennsylvania or eastern Tennessee. It has a very similar feel to that. Another place where I've been would be Vermont, where there's a lot of trees, a lot of hills, and not a lot of people. In 1918, the hill where I stopped to try and get my bearings was identified on American maps as Hill 198. And when you drive through that area and you come to Hill 198, you'll see a sign that doesn't really stand out all that much, and there aren't really a lot of other markers around. But the sign has an arrow that points down what is kind of a wooded cliff, right down the side of the road. As soon as you park, if you were to get out the passenger side of your car, you would roll down the side of the hill. It's that steep and that close. But it's a location that indicates an event that captured the attention of the American public in the final weeks of the Great War. That event has gone down in history as the story of the Lost Battalion. As we discuss the events that transpired in the Argonne with what we know today as the Lost Battalion, I'm going to be relying pretty heavily on the words of a Private Ralph John, who was a member of Company A of the 308th Infantry Regiment. He wrote a brief memoir of what happened in those days. He was one of the survivors. And in the foreword to his memoir of those events, he wrote these words, quote, "Nothing makes a man feel heartsick more than the awful picture of men repeating an event, which had, even the first time, such horrible results on human beings. Maybe 24 years is a long time to some people, long enough for them to forget. But to me, the World War is not as easy as that to forget. It seems like yesterday that I experienced what I experience even today in dreams. Men being killed in action, men wounded, suffering, and crying for care when no help was possible. The 5 days of being lost in the famous pocket are too vivid in my mind to forget. 5 days of horror and bloodshed for what we as soldiers in the Lost Battalion thought was a just cause. Today we still think it was a just cause, but it seems to me that we are slipping into a situation where another dreadful experience like mine will be necessary for the young men of today. If such a case happens, it seems to me that it is very important for the young men to keep in mind the picture of what happened in 1917, and especially in October 1918. I hope I can make them think twice by writing my experiences as they really happened. I have tried to do that in the pages that follow. You see, Ralph John was writing this as the Second World War raged in Europe and in the Pacific. And so he knew all too well what men were going to have to experience. So as we take a look at these events, I'm going to try to give an overview of what was happening on a strategic scale, but we're also going to rely, as I mentioned, pretty heavily on Ralph John's experience, because I love getting that ground level view of what was going on for a private in what we know today as the Lost Battalion. On the morning of September 26th, 1918, the largest offensive in the history of the United States military began. It was known as the Meuse-Argonne offensive, named after the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. And the officer in command of the Argonne part of the offensive was a general named Evan Johnson. Johnson issued the following order to his divisions. He said, quote, "It is again impressed upon every officer and man of this command that ground once captured must under no circumstances be given up in the absence of direct, positive, and formal orders to do so emanating from these headquarters. Troops occupying ground must be supported against counterattack and all gains held. It is a favorite trick of the Boche," which was a nickname given to the German soldiers, "to spread confusion by calling out 'retire' or 'fall back.' If in action any such command is heard, officers and men may be sure that it is given by the enemy. Whoever gives such a command is a traitor, and it is the duty of any officer or man who is loyal to his country and who hears such an order to shoot the offender upon the spot. We are not going back, but forward." End quote. There was a similar instruction given to the British soldiers on the first day at the Battle of the Somme. Apparently, for quite some time, there had been an issue with German soldiers shouting out instructions in the heat of battle that were being followed by Allied soldiers. And so commanders, whether they were British, French, or Americans now, were having to give these orders telling people, do not fall back under any circumstances. And it was that set of circumstances, that specific order that was given, that would be followed by a man named Major Charles Whittlesey and lead directly to the events that we're going to talk about today. Charles Whittlesey was not a career soldier. He was born in 1884 in the tiny town of Florence, Wisconsin, which is in the northeast part of the state. His father was a logger, and he grew up attending school in the equally small town of Green Bay, Wisconsin. When Charles was 10 years old, the family moved to Massachusetts, and he graduated from Pittsfield High School there in the class of 1901. He enrolled then at Williams College, and he was actually voted as one of the smartest members of his class. And he had kind of an aristocratic manner about him. He didn't come across very favorably to a lot of the people who went to school with him, and they gave him the nickname Count Whittlesey because of the way he carried himself. He eventually went to Harvard Law School, and it was from Harvard that he graduated with a law degree in 1908. After graduation, he moved to New York City, where he set up a law partnership with a classmate from Williams College. And he spent several years as a member of the American Socialist Party before he got disgusted with their increasing extremism as he saw it, and he decided to withdraw from that party. When the United States entered the Great War in the spring of 1917, Whittlesey took a leave of absence from his partnership in the law office and joined the United States Army. He was commissioned as a captain in the 308th Infantry of the 77th Infantry Division, known as the Liberty Division. It's the same division that in World War II would be made famous by the likes of Desmond Doss. And if you ever see the movie Hacksaw Ridge, you'll see that same Statue of Liberty patch on the shoulder of Desmond Doss that you see on members of the Lost Battalion in the film about their story. Because the 77th Division was primarily made up of men from New York City, it was sometimes known as the Metropolitan Division, and it was really a microcosm of New York City as a whole. It had men from so many different backgrounds and so many different nations. In fact, the members of the division spoke 42 different languages or dialects. By the time of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Charles Whittlesey was a major in command of the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry Regiment. On October 1st, he was given his orders. First, he was to advance north up the ravine de Argonne until it ended at the ravine de Charlevoix. Once he reached that point, they were to continue across the brook and take the Charlevoix Mill. Behind the mill was the Binarville-La Virguette road. The securing of the mill was important for seizing control of the road and a rail line that ran parallel to the north of it. The road was crucial because it allowed for the movement of supplies between Allied soldiers. The railway was crucial because it would cut off one of the Germans' major supply routes. The plan called for the 1st Battalion to lead the assault, led personally by Major Whittlesey. They would be supported by the 2nd Battalion, led by Captain George McMurtry. Just after 5 p.m. that first evening, the attack came to a halt, and the men dug in for the night. The next morning, October 2nd, final orders came in at around 0500. The main objective for the day was still the Binarville-La Virguette road. The attack was to begin at 7 o'clock in the morning to give time for the fog to lift and for the men to get something to eat. Whittlesey and McMurtry ordered companies D and F to remain along the western ridge to become a containing force. The rest of the 1st and 2nd Battalions would then continue along Hill 198 to complete a flanking maneuver on the enemy. There was just one problem with that. The problem was that on that hill there was a double trench line of German soldiers. The plan was that once the 2 battalions took the hill, they would then send back companies E and H to create a line connecting to companies D and F, thus extending their line between the 2 positions. Lieutenant James Leake was a member of E Company of the 308th Infantry, and in 1938, he gave a speech at Abilene Christian College in Texas. And this is what he said about the situation going into October of 1918 for these men. He said, "At the outset of the Argonne Drive, the approximate strength of each of the companies in the 308th Infantry was 154 men. After 7 or 8 days fighting, the strength of these companies had been materially reduced. A Company had only 18 men under the command of the sergeant. My company, which was E Company, had only 58 men. The strongest company did not have over 100 men. These men had not had a hot meal since the start of the Argonne Drive on the morning of the 26th of September, and had been in the line since September 20th. They never had a meal of any kind after September 30th, and what little they had to eat was their hard rations, namely hardtack, and very few of them had this. The weather was raining throughout the day and freezing at night. The men did not have overcoats or blankets, but were dressed in their regulation uniforms. Some 50 men in each company prior to September 20th had never even loaded an army rifle and were untrained soldiers, having been inducted into the service in July preceding. These were the men who were from the Northwest Plains." And what he's making reference to there is that by this point, this previously all New York unit was being filled in with replacements from other parts of the country. By the night of October 2nd, after another long day of fighting, Major Whittlesey received information that the men had found a way up the right side of Hill 198. And around the same time, the French experienced a massive counterattack by the Germans and were forced to fall back, thus exposing the left flank of the 308th. The same occurred on the right flank with the American troops, causing the 308th to be outflanked on both sides. The problem was they didn't discover this until shortly after they had reached the top of Hill 198. The hill was now in their control. However, it was too quiet for Whittlesey. He realized he couldn't hear anything of the 307th that was supposed to be on his right flank. Later on, he said that he thought, quote, either they had broken through the line as well and reached their objective over there, or they had been licked and fallen back. The former would be good news for the 308th. The latter, however, was unthinkable. Orders forbade it, end quote. And while all of that was happening, to the rear of the main action, George W. Quinn, who was a runner for the battalion, was killed attempting to reach Major Whittlesey with a message from his adjutant, Lieutenant Arthur McKeough. Whittlesey earlier in the day had sent the adjutant back about 150 yards with a group of 15 men with light machine guns to silence German machine gunners who had cut communications between Whittlesey's battalion and the American rear during the night. The Germans were taking ground from which they could surround Whittlesey's men. The undelivered message asked for a mortar to use against the strong German position. Private Ralph John of Company A described what was happening on October 2nd. He said, "We had orders to advance straight north, but on this day we run into fierce machine gun fire in thick woods. It was too thick for the artillery even to do much good, and to try to go straight through it was sure suicide. So our commander, who was Major Charles W. Whittlesey, turned the outfit toward a hill on our right. We made it over the top of this little hill in nice shape, and as the enemy fire has been so intense, and as it was getting dark fast, we were commanded to gig in for the night. And on the downgrade of the slope, and protected more or less here from the artillery fire of the Germans. Early the next morning, some more men stumbled onto us, and we learned that the balance of the men supporting us on the right had been cut off. Major Whittlesey sent a man back to get orders and find out how the advance was to be made for the day, and they quickly returned advising they couldn't get through. He knew then that we had been entirely cut off from all support and were surrounded by the Germans. There were something over 500 men from various companies in this lot who were cut off in what is now historically famous as the Pocket, and which men have become known as the Lost Battalion. Lieutenant James Leake, who I quoted earlier in his speech to Abilene Christian, discussed this idea of the Lost Battalion, which was a name that was used by newspapers, and it quickly spread and just became one of those sensationalist media terms. But as Lieutenant Leake said, he said, quote, "In the outset, you may understand that the Lost Battalion is entirely a misnomer. First, it was not a battalion, but was composed of 7 companies of infantry and 1 machine gun company. A battalion is composed of only 4 companies. Second, it was not lost. We knew exactly where we were and went to the exact position to which we had been ordered. This organization was under command of Major Charles Whittlesey. It consisted of companies A, B, C, E, G, and H, 308th Infantry, Company K of the 307th Infantry, and Company C, 306th Machine Gun Battalion." So a number of these units were not originally under Whittlesey's direct command, but he now found himself the highest ranking officer among those who were surrounded in this area that they called the Pocket. And he went about very quickly setting up the best defensive position he possibly could. He put his 2 best companies on the flanks with support from the weaker companies. A single company took up the front of the Pocket. The rear, which was the least protected from attack, was defended by just a few riflemen and a few machine guns. The hill slopes steeply from the front of the Pocket, making it difficult for the Germans to bomb the battalion from that direction. Now, the biggest flaw in their position was that their holes were dug too close together, and too many men were occupying those holes at the same time. This you might attribute to the fact that you've got a number of replacements who have not really experienced a great deal of combat. Remember, you're also dealing with officer command from men who are not career soldiers. So it was a difficult situation, and it was not something any of them were really, truly prepared for. By about 22:30 on the night of October 2nd, Whittlesey realized that Hill 205 was still occupied by the Germans on the left, and that the ravine to the right was also full of enemy soldiers. On the morning of the 3rd of October, he tried to reestablish contact with the flanks and with the companies that had been left behind. He sent out runners to the French and American units that were supposed to be on his flanks. None of the runners that he sent out returned, neither from the flanks nor from trying to connect with the companies that he had left behind. All of them were either killed or captured by the Germans. The more time that passed without any messages, the more Whittlesey was coming to the conclusion that they were indeed surrounded. But the Germans weren't attacking. The German forces within the ravine believed that they were actually outnumbered by the Americans, and so they waited. It's this situation that these men find themselves in that I think makes this such a compelling story and is the reason why the American public was captured by their predicament. We love a good underdog story. We love the story of the hopeless situation. That's why people are drawn to stories like the Alamo or Bastogne in World War II. Or if you look at a little more obscure reference, somewhere like Rorke's Drift in South Africa in the late 19th century. Situations where small groups of men find themselves heavily outnumbered, find themselves without enough supply, without enough support, in a seemingly hopeless situation. And that's where these men find themselves. They don't know what's going on. They don't know if anyone's trying to get to them. They don't even know for sure if their superiors know that they're surrounded. There's really very little information, and that's probably the scariest part if you're Whittlesey. You just don't know what's going on. You don't know how long you're going to be there. You don't know how many men you're facing. You don't know how long you're going to hold out. But this lawyer from Harvard knew one thing for sure. He had orders to hold and not to fall back under any circumstances. And he was going to follow those orders to the end. Lieutenant Leake said this about the situation. He said, quote, "I have said this incident was in a measure like the Alamo. Neither outfit gave up. The Lost Battalion held its position and demonstrated to Germans and the world that Americans possessed courage. These soldiers were largely from New York City and from the Northwest Plains. There were Irish, Canadian French, English, Jews, Italians, Swedes, Norwegians, Northerners, Southerners, but Americans all in this outfit, all fighting bravely for the land of liberty. There were Jew and Gentile, Catholic and Protestant, all fighting as brothers under our stars and stripes, patriots, each and all of them, each ready to give up life for his country. Truly those of them who gave their lives have shown their patriotism, for greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." He was quoting John 15:13, when Jesus said that the night that he went to be arrested and later to the cross, from the Gospels. Lieutenant Leake described the action of October 3rd. He said, "On the morning of the 3rd, just before daylight, my company was ordered back to the position where on the preceding day we had assaulted and driven the Germans from their trenches, and that left companies D and F. Our mission was to bring those two companies up to the rest of the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 308th. As we started back, we were attacked by a machine gun on the hill on our right. This machine gun was silenced and the crew taken prisoner. Then we proceeded on toward our objective, and just before we reached it, we were fired upon from each flank and from the front. The Germans were to the right of us, and to the left of us, and to the front of us. They attempted to close in behind us, but a small portion of my company, myself and 17 others, succeeded in fighting our way through the lines behind us. while another portion succeeding in pushing its way forward across the trench. I reported to Major Whittlesey upon my return what I had found. Another company, in which was Lieutenant Thomas G. Poole of Port Arthur, Texas, was ordered by the Major to attempt to break through the German line. This company also failed and returned to our position on the hillside, after having lost considerable of its men. No other determined effort to break through the line was made by our forces on the hillside, and our efforts were mainly directed toward warding off attacks made upon us by the enemy. The Germans on the top of the hill constantly threw hand grenades upon us and directed several attacks each day at us. We were exposed to machine gun fire from the hill directly south of us and one to the southwest. We had no food, but were fortunate in that we could secure water from the mountain creek immediately south of us, but this had to be obtained in the darkness of the night. And by this point in the standoff, both sides had suffered significant casualties. Private Ralph John described the situation from his perspective. This is what he said about it. He said there were a lot of German soldiers on that hill in front of us, around which there was a road near the top. They seemed to know that we were surrounded and felt that they could handle us with machine guns and potato masher bombs. If we tried to make the open space at the bottom of the hill, snipers and machine guns would have picked off every man as soon as he stepped in the clear. Our men had not come up for relief during the night, and we had practically no eats at all. Just a few cans of corn willy and hardtack, and no water at all. There were some in a small stream at the bottom of the hill which we could not get to at all during the daytime, but which some of the fellows did succeed in reaching at night later on. They would fill up a few canteens and then beat it back into the brush, protected by a lot of men hidden behind the trees at the edge of the clearing. We soon began to search the dead men for food and ammunition. There were a lot of men just lying outside the woods in the clear space. Once I trotted out there to search for more food and ammunition, but the bullets were flying too thick for me. It seems like they were coming from all sides. The way I went into the brush, I was sure behind myself. You may laugh at this, but if you had been there, you wouldn't have had time to laugh. The bullets were close enough to clip the leaves off the trees and low brush so that they would sting the devil out of my face. Yet none of them hit me. I wondered then, as I have done millions of times while fighting in France, how in the deuce I ever got through it all without being hit by a single bullet. It seemed almost impossible. But our food was almost entirely gone, and the men had to have water. The Germans were trying every way to get at us, using potato mashers, machine guns, and trench mortars in bitter attacks. But we had dug in, and the Major was not going to give ground. They even tried sending messages to us asking that we surrender and speaking commands in English to make our commanders think there were American soldiers close by. But Major Whittlesey said he'd never give in. Messages had been sent out by carrier pigeon asking for aid and giving our location, but it seemed they must have all been killed, for the next day rolled around and there was no help in sight. Now, what happened next has been the source of a great deal of controversy and debate with regards to how and why it happened. But the men of the Lost Battalion began to experience a devastating artillery barrage, courtesy of the American artillery. Now, some believe that Whittlesey had relayed the wrong coordinates. Others argue that Whittlesey had the coordinates right and it was the artillery who had the wrong aim. Either way, the fact was that Whittlesey and his men were on the advance of the north slope of the Charlevoix ravine, and the artillery thought they were on the south slope. None of the runners that had been sent by Whittlesey had made it back to the Americans' lines, so he used the only other available resource he had: carrier pigeons. Those had been unsuccessful so far as well. The first carrier pigeon he sent had a message that said, "Many wounded, we cannot evacuate." But that pigeon was shot down. A second bird was sent with a message, "Men are suffering. Can support be sent?" That pigeon was also shot down. By the time the friendly artillery fire came crashing down on the Lost Battalion, Whittlesey had one pigeon left. His name was Cher Ami, which means dear friend in French. Cher Ami was dispatched with a note written on onion paper in a canister on his right leg. As the bird was released, Whittlesey described what happened next. He said, quote, "A shell exploded directly below the bird, killing 5 of our men and stunning the pigeon so that it fluttered to the ground midway between the spring and the bridge we crossed to get into the pocket," end quote. Cher Ami managed to take flight again despite having been severely wounded and successfully delivered Whittlesey's message, which said, quote, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it," end quote. Cher Ami, in the course of that journey, had been shot through the breast, blinded in one eye, and had a leg hanging on only by a tendon. He was tended to by army medics, and thereafter was considered a hero for the 77th Division for his actions that day. Private Ralph John gave his perspective on what happened that day in his account of the events of the Lost Battalion. He said, "Right after noon on the third day, with no assistance in sight, and the major refusing to give up to the many ruses used by the Germans to get him to surrender, there came one of the worst barrages I have ever seen. My buddy and I were lying in the same dugout listening to the shells come over. We could tell about where they were going to hit. He would say, 'Here's the one that is coming close,' and it did strike, too close for comfort. Dirt was thrown sky high and both of us were nearly buried. I had only one hand out in the open. With this one free hand, I reached my shovel and dug myself and then my buddy out. We had just got ourselves out when another shell hit close by and we were buried again. The third time was too much and we started looking for a safer place. As I was walking around, I stepped on something that wasn't too solid and felt it roll under my feet. I looked down and there were 3 men lying on the ground covered up with dirt until you couldn't see them. They were still alive but stunned. I would not have known they were there if I hadn't stepped on the leg of one of them. My buddy and I laid flat on the ground to keep the flying shrapnel from the shells from hitting us. This shrapnel would make an ugly wound and was a lot worse than machine gun bullets, many of which would go right through a man and leave a clean hole. Neither my buddy or I got a scratch, but there were a lot of shrapnel that came awfully close, so close that we could just about feel it whiz by. But a miss is as good as a mile. Soon we realized that it was our own artillery that was bombing us. I certainly would have hated to be a German and have to take barrages like this one very often. That artillery fire that afternoon was the worst attack of the whole siege. Major Whittlesey released the last carrier pigeon along about the middle of the afternoon, and when that pigeon took off, it carried a prayer from every man there. It seemed the absolute last hope of any relief. Food was all gone. Some little later, the firing from the artillery stopped, and we all had hope that our message had gotten through. I've read other accounts of that shelling that really put in perspective just how absolutely devastating it was. One account described that something in the neighborhood of 200 men had been killed, not only from the artillery shelling, but from the German attacks to that point, and that the bodies of pretty much all of those 200 men were just completely obliterated by this American artillery fire to the point where none of them could be identified. After the Allied shelling finally stopped, the Germans took advantage and launched an attack. They suffered significant losses in vicious hand-to-hand combat and were eventually driven back once again. Although a number of men had been killed or captured, the unit remained intact. But as you can imagine, morale was dangerously low, and sickness was now setting in. Many of the men had just a few rounds of ammunition left, and none of them had any food. Bandages were being taken off of the dead and reused on those who were wounded but still alive. A package was reported to have been dropped in for the men to resupply, but all reports point to it falling instead into German territory. As previously mentioned, there was water that was accessible, but getting to it required exposing yourself to constant German sniper fire. From the 5th to the 8th of October, the Germans continued repeated attacks. The Germans also sent repeated demands for the American troops to surrender. In fact, there was one incident on October 7th in which the Germans sent forward a blindfolded American POW carrying a white flag with a message written in English, and this is what it said: "The suffering of your wounded men can be heard over here in the German lines, and we are appealing to your humane sentiments to stop. A white flag shown by one of your men will tell us that you agree with these conditions. Please treat Private Lowell R. Hollingshead as an honorable man. He is quite a soldier. We envy you." Signed, the German commanding officer. Now, allegedly, Whittlesey's reply was, "You go to hell." But he denied having said that, saying instead that no response was necessary. He ordered white sheets that had been placed as signals for the Allied aircraft to drop supplies be pulled and hidden so that they wouldn't be mistaken for a signal that they wished to surrender. Now, while all of this was going on, there was a desperate attempt by the entire 77th Division to break through to the men of the Lost Battalion. With each attack by members of that division, the efforts grew weaker and weaker as their combat power ebbed. In the first 4 days of rescue attempts, the 308th Infantry alone lost 766 men. One of the members of the 77th Division, who was lost in the attempts to reach the Lost Battalion, was another man from Harvard, another lawyer from Harvard. His name was Harvard Eddie Grant, and he was a Major League Baseball player. He had played for a number of teams, including Cleveland, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and finally the New York Giants. He retired from baseball right before the Great War and opened a law practice in Boston. He was one of the very first men to enlist when the United States entered the First World War on April of 1917. And he became a captain in the 77th Infantry Division. His superior officers were killed or wounded during the rescue attempts. And so Captain Grant took command of his troops on a 4-day search for the Lost Battalion. And it was during that search that an exploding shell killed Eddie Grant on October 5th of 1918. He was the first of 8 Major League Baseball players who died during the First World War. I had the opportunity to visit Captain Grant's grave when I was in France at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery. If you ever get the opportunity, I'm telling you, even if you've been to Arlington, even if you've been to some of the most beautiful cemeteries we have here in the States, honestly, there's nothing like it. There is nothing like the cemeteries in Europe. I'd say, having visited a number of them, and I haven't been to them all, I haven't been to Normandy yet, Meuse-Argonne and probably the World War II cemetery at Henri-Chapelle in Belgium are probably the 2 most beautiful American cemeteries I've been to in my entire life. Meuse-Argonne is the largest American cemetery anywhere in Europe. And it was there that Eddie Grant was laid to rest. Another grave I had an opportunity to visit when I was at the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery was that of Erwin Bleckley, who had initially been commissioned as an artillery officer but then volunteered for aviation training and duty. And he was killed in an attempt to help the Lost Battalion as well. He was a member of the 50th Aero Squadron, and the 50th was attempting to drop supplies and carrier pigeons to the 308th using small parachutes from flares to soften the descent. Bleckley was the observer in a plane being flown by First Lieutenant Harold Goetler, and on October 6th of 1918, they took off to try and locate the position of the Lost Battalion. After they had completed their first mission, they returned to their base with a number of holes in their aircraft from small arms fire. And they were having problems with their spark plugs, and problems that had been going on for several days. They were warned by their squadron commander that a second sortie would be much more difficult and hazardous now that the Germans were expecting them. But Bleckley was quoted as saying, "We'll make a delivery or die in the attempt." Late in the afternoon, they flew their second resupply mission in aircraft number 6, which had been borrowed from another pilot because their own plane could not fly. There was an eyewitness description of what happened next. It said, quote, "Gottler skidded his plane, he made turns, he side-slipped a little occasionally, he climbed and then dived. Each time the plane turned and its great mottled belly flopped back into normal position, the men of the Lost Battalion expected to see it tumble from the sky. But on its way it went like a charmed thing, roaring up and down and across, rocked occasionally by the ash of big shells that had just passed. The plane finally crashed into the French terrain." End quote. For their actions that day, both men were recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross. Those awards were later upgraded to the Medal of Honor. Irwin Bleckley's Medal of Honor citation reads as follows: "Second Lieutenant Bleckley, with his pilot, left the aerodrome late in the afternoon on their second trip to drop supplies to a battalion of the 77th Division, which had been cut off by the enemy in the Argonne Forest. Having been subjected on the first trip to violent fire from the enemy, they attempted on the second trip to come still lower in order to get packages even more precisely on the designated spot. In the course of his mission, the plane was brought down by enemy rifle and machine gun fire from the ground, resulting in fatal wounds to Second Lieutenant Bleckley, who died before he could be taken to a hospital. In attempting and performing this mission, Second Lieutenant Bleckley showed the highest possible contempt of personal danger, devotion to duty, courage, and valor." By this point, the news of the Lost Battalion's situation had not only reached the newspapers back home, it had also reached the highest levels of the American command. While the 77th Division found itself weaker and unable to do anything about the situation, another powerful U.S. force under General Hunter Liggett's First Corps was being assembled. The veteran 28th Infantry Division was sent to reach Whittlesey, and the fresh 82nd Infantry Division was moved in to reinforce the 28th's flank. General Pershing then ordered Liggett to be reinforced by the 1st Infantry Division. Now, observing the movement of the 1st Division, the Germans ordered a Prussian Guards Division to reinforce their forces in the sector. They also set an elite battalion of stormtroopers reinforced with flamethrowers to aid the German infantry in attacking the Lost Battalion. For the next few days, the pocket held firm, and eventually these reinforcements sent by the American army started to push the Germans back. Not knowing what was going on and whether they were going to be rescued, Whittlesey, in his desperation, asked for a volunteer who would be willing to sneak through the lines to try and get help. Private Abraham Krotoshinsky was the volunteer. He left the pocket took a long route to the north and eventually made it to a company of the 307th Infantry. Krotoshinsky then acted as a guide, leading that company to help rescue the trapped companies and establish a route for further fresh troops to come into the pocket. By the 8th of October, the relief force had finally linked up with Whittlesey's men, and the Lost Battalion had been found. Of the 554 men who initially defended the pocket, 194 walked out of the Argonne Forest. 197 had been killed, and the rest were either missing or taken prisoner. In total, 5 people were awarded the Medal of Honor for their actions in connection with the Lost Battalion, including Major Whittlesey and his second-in-command, Captain McMurtry. There were over 30 Distinguished Service Crosses awarded, including one for Private Krotoshinsky for his bravery in sneaking through the lines to connect with the rescue company. Krotoshinsky would actually go on to play himself in a movie made about the Lost Battalion in 1919. But it wasn't just soldiers who were commemorated for their heroism in those days in October of 1918. Cher Ami, that brave carrier pigeon whose mission saved the survivors of the Lost Battalion, was treated as an American hero. When he recovered enough to travel, the now one-legged bird was put on a boat to the United States with General John J. Pershing himself seeing him off. He was awarded the French Croix de Guerre for heroism under fire, and when he died in 1919, he was placed on display at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., where you can still see him to this day. I can't end this story without talking about Major Charles Whittlesey and the aftermath of these events. After the battalion came out of their fight at Hill 198, Whittlesey was immediately promoted to lieutenant colonel. His was one of the 3 first Medals of Honor to be awarded for the Great War, and he was immediately hailed as a national hero. After the war, he tried to return to his career as a lawyer on Wall Street, but he was constantly hounded to do speeches, parades, or to receive honorary degrees. He never married or had any children. At one point, he told a friend, "Not a day goes by, but I hear from some of my old outfit, usually about some sorrow or misfortune. I cannot bear it much more." In November 1921, along with Alvin York and a few others, Whittlesey was selected to act as a pallbearer for the burial of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. A few days after, he boarded a ship from New York to Havana, Cuba. The first night of the trip, he had dinner with the captain. Then late that evening, he excused himself, saying he was retiring for the evening. The captain said that Whittlesey was in good spirits. He was never seen again. Before leaving New York, he had prepared his will, and in his cabin on the ship were found a series of letters left for his relatives and friends, as well as instructions for the disposition of his luggage. It was presumed that he jumped overboard, but his body was never recovered. This man, this hero of the Great War, a man who wasn't even really a soldier, he was a lawyer from Harvard, who wanted to do his duty to his country, found himself in the worst of situations, and showed himself to be a leader among men, was unable to deal with the aftermath of what he experienced in those first days of October in the Argonne Forest. I don't think it would be right for any of us to judge him, because we can't possibly know the pain that he carried. We can't possibly know what it was like to lead those men. And though he was a hero, he was also severely scarred from his leadership of the Lost Battalion. May he and all of these brave men rest in peace.